Here's another really popular one, guys. The 23rd episode of the second series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Mainline Engines, Edward's Exploit. This episode has gained quite a following recently. It's become one of the most talked about and iconic episodes of the TV series in most recent years. So what is it about this episode that makes people remember it so much? Let's dive into the story before we go into all that. Bertie has been giving several visitors a tour across the island of Sodor, and on their last afternoon, Edward prepares to take them to visit Bill and Ben, but has trouble starting due to the packed coaches and is made fun of by Henry and James for how much he is struggling, while Gordon grumbles that it is time for Edward to retire. Duck and Boko take exception to this and defend him, telling the big engines that Edward is superior to all of them, knowing that Edward is capable of far more than he seems. Finally, Edward manages to start and leaves the station. When he arrives at the junction, the passengers meet Bill and Ben, who enjoy the attention and having pictures taken. The passengers then board the twins' brake vans and travel to the China Clay Works. The visitors have a wonderful day, being very impressed with the place as well as the twins. Afterwards, the twins with the passengers return to the junction and board Edward's coaches to head home. On the way back, the weather turns bad and begins to rain hard. As Edward fights the elements, his sanding gear fails, which forces his firemen to ride out front on the running board and manually sand the rails by hand. But there is worse to come. Without warning, Edward's wheels suddenly slip fiercely, which leads to something breaking with a shrieking crack and forcing him to stop. Edward's crew examine him and find a broken crank pin, forcing them to remove his side rods. His driver reminds Edward that they must get the visitors back to the station as soon as possible since they must leave tonight. Edward promises to try. Edward tries to start, but his wheels and the slippery rails prevent him from moving. The passengers become anxious, so Edward's crew and the guard make more adjustments. They loosen the couplings between the coaches so that Edward can be able to pick them up one by one as he does with trucks. Edward cautiously makes another attempt to start. This time it works. Edward is forced to go slowly, but keeps steady and finally makes it back to the station where Henry is waiting for him. The Fat Controller angrily points to the clock, but he is swept aside by the cheerful passengers who thank Edward and his crew for all their hard work. Afterwards, Edward wearily returns to the sheds. Duck and Boko make sure Edward is left in peace as Gordon and James remain silent out of respect. I'm trying to think about what I could say about this episode that most other fans, including the Unlucky Tug, have already said. Because everybody's seen this episode and everybody is in love with it. So I'm going to make a good effort to not repeat anything that the Unlucky Tug said, or at least make a little spin on what he's already said in his little editorial video of the episode. This is the episode where Edward really takes the time to shine, and it brings back his mechanical difficulties that he'd been having throughout Series 2. We all knew from Cowles onwards that he had worn out parts, but in this episode his problems get worse as it leads to his crankpins breaking. Of course, in the Railway series he actually did get physically damaged, whereas in the TV series adaptation there was no damage to him at all and they only remove his side rods. Now it could be argued that the team didn't really have the budget to make a second Edward model just to break, so they had to use what they already had. But it is a really effective episode. Like Edward's introduction episode in the first series, it really shows that just because you're old, that doesn't mean that you've had it and you should give up. Edward still had some fight in him despite his damage, and even though the odds are stacked against him with the weather and his broken crank pin, he still makes an effort to try and get the train back before the passengers had to leave the island. And that's just one of the great lessons of the episode as well as the TV series as a whole. Determination. Just because something is stacked against you, that doesn't mean that you should give up instantly, and that you should try again until you get it right. Now some other characters in this series, like maybe Gordon and James, would have probably thrown in the towel instantly. Well, James might have tried to carry on since he did so in Troublesome Trucks, but Gordon would obviously give up since he did give up pulling trucks on his own hill. But Edward is not like them and doesn't throw in the towel. He keeps going despite being damaged. Any of the other engines probably would have thrown in the towel and then waited for a backup engine, but Edward just pushed himself to the breaking point just to get the train back on time. He's an engine who never gives up, and that's why he's one of the most important characters in the series. And even when he's trying his best after removing his side rods and to go single like an old-fashioned engine, he still can't really do it because of the weight of the coaches and how wet the rails are. But after a few adjustments and with the help of his crew, he struggles on again until he finally manages to get the train moving. And you can feel the excitement in the characters' voices as well as the music, that everything's going to be fine from here on in. It's one of those episodes that has you wondering whether things are going to turn out alright in the end, and then when it does turn out alright in the end, it's all the more great having sat through it. Even if you've watched this episode several times before, it's still one of the best episodes to watch. Because even though you may have seen this episode hundreds of times before, it's still great to re-watch years later. It's an episode that just gets better and better each time I re-watch it. And that's how a well-written episode should be. An episode that you would have seen before and know what's going to happen, but you just want to re-watch it again and again because of how wonderfully written and adapted it is. It's just another one of those episodes that has a long-lasting effect on fans, no matter how many times you watch it. Something that might throw people off this episode is probably the fact that there's no actual rain in the episode, when it's said that wind and rain batters him. But like with Breaking Edward, that would have cost extra money and they had limitations back then for what they could do with the models and the sets. So you can forgive them for not including actual rain in the episode because of their limitations back then. But none of this ruins this fantastic episode for the TV series. And Sir Ringo Starr definitely gets the emotions right in this episode. With his performances, he really gets the feel of the episode's emotions. You really feel what these characters are going through throughout the entire adventure. It just proves to every Thomas fan that Sir Ringo Starr is one of the best narrators of the TV series. I also love that new variant of Edward's theme that plays just before Edward's crankpin breaks. It's sort of a continuation from his Fall Series 2 theme, but a more danger-filled theme. Like a lot of the danger themes for the TV series, even though nothing's happened yet, you just get the feel whenever you listen to it that something bad is about to happen. It's one of those bits of music that O Donnell and Jr. Campbell composed that really conveys the emotions of the scene. Unlike most of the danger themes that Mike and Jr. composed, shit only hits the fan near the very end of the tune, making it all the more dramatic. Edward's Exploit is definitely the best episode of the second series. I'd even go so far as to say that it's the best episode in the series as a whole. This is an episode that I definitely recommend checking out if you're a Edward the Blue Engine fan and a Thomas the Tank Engine fan in general. It's one of the greatest episodes of the TV series ever made, about how you should never give up even if the odds are thrown against you. It's definitely worth a watch. It's one of the greats.